Studebaker-Packard was formed from two storied brands that merged together in weakness and only lasted about 12 years before being absorbed and lost to history. I don't really remember either company other than from, say, classic car shows, but I appreciate what they each separately brought to the industry. And this is a far too brief history of Studebaker-Packard. So welcome back to All Cars, you all. I'm John, and Packard and Studebaker predate me, which is, while I know of them, I've seen it's more as an auto show thing, something to appreciate, rather than a desire from my youth. The combined company had a very short history trying to merge two weak companies into something stronger. Yeah, that didn't really work out. But separately, they each have an incredible rich history. To me, this is truly one of the saddest yet entirely predictable failures in American automotive history. Now, Studebaker-Packard was formed in 1954 when Packard, the smaller company, bought Studebaker. But to get to that point, let's step back in history and look at each of them separately. Now, Studebaker was founded way back in 1852 to build wagons, buggies, and as a coach builder. And over nearly 50 decades, they built a reputation for quality, durability, and reliability. But to get to that point, let's step back a little bit further. In 1736, Peter Studebaker, later changed his name, his wife, brother, sister-in-law, and cousin all arrived in Philadelphia and settled in Pennsylvania as a highly respected wagon maker, utilizing his knowledge as a master craftsman from Germany to build up a successful business and using a secret technology for stronger wood and steel, and ultimately passing his knowledge on down through his children. His son, Peter Jr., had Clement Studebaker, whose son, John Clement Studebaker, had 5 sons and 5 daughters, and those 5 sons started Studebaker Corporation in 1852, based on the founding beliefs of Peter Sr., quote, give them more than they ask for. They were successful at wagon manufacturing. In 1895, the chairman of the executive committee urged the development of a, quote, practical horseless carriage. And by 1897, 2 years later, they had an, singular, engineer working on a motor vehicle. Originally, they focused on a battery-powered vehicle, and they manufactured their Studebaker Electric from 1902 to 1911. And during this time began manufacturing bodies for 2 different gas-powered marques. One of these was known as Garford, and they entered into a partnership with them to make gas-powered cars in 1904. In 1910, they decided to refinance and incorporate as Studebaker Corporation, which was completed in 1911, the same year they stopped making those electric vehicles, and they ended up taking over the facilities of their second gas car partner, which was Everett Metzger Flanders, EMF, out of Detroit. Now, EMF customers were complaining, so Studebaker paid mechanics to go out to the customers to fix problems. What they found was very commonly that rear axle failure was the worst, the most common. This became baked into the company that they strive to design for life, and leading to that reputation for rugged dependability. Now, World War I ended up being pretty good for the companies. They had orders for tens of thousands of wagons, artillery harnesses, and saddles, and ambulances from Britain, France, and Russia. After taking over EMF, they began using their own name on the cars. By 1918, they released their famous Big Six and Special Six. Of an interesting historical note, at the time, the annual capacity of the 7 Studebaker plants was 100,000 autos and 75,000 horse-drawn carriages. In 1919, 1 year after World War I, they ended the regular manufacture of horse-drawn vehicles and would end up adding a truck line to replace them. Another fascinating note to me is that during this period, Studebaker had a trio of outstanding engineers known as the Three Musketeers: Frederick Zeder, worked with EMF and was appointed the head of Studebaker Engineering. He brought in Carl Breer with him in 1913, and in 1916 they added Owen Skelton, who was a transmission specialist with, ironically, Packard. In 1920, these three were wooed away by one gentleman by the name of Walter P. Chrysler. And these guys actually deserve their own video, because ultimately they became the nucleus of Chrysler's engineering department and that entire company's reputation for quality engineering. In 1926, Studebaker became the first auto manufacturer in the U.S. to have an outdoor proving ground. The last of their Detroit plant was moved to South Bend, and the Erskine 6 was launched successfully. In 1929, they had expanded to 50 models, and business was so good, 90% of their earnings were being paid out as dividends. And then the Great Depression hit. Now, Albert Russell Erskine became the Studebaker president in 1915, and when the Great Depression hit, he pushed for the development of a new low-cost car called the Rockney. In 1930, two gentlemen who owned an engineering consulting firm were commissioned by Willis Overland to design two new prototypes and a new six-cylinder engine. When completed, they presented them and were told that Willis Overland was about to go out of business and they could take their cars and do with them as they pleased, so they happened to stop by South Bend, and Erskine bought them on the spot and brought them in as engineers within Studebaker. The Rockney was introduced in 1932 with two models. Now, the larger one was actually based on Studebaker's own 6 model, and the smaller one on a 110-inch wheelbase was based on that concept car these engineering consulting firm came up with. This was the depth of the recession. They sold extremely poorly. In 1933, it was reduced to just the one model, the smaller one. These prototypes came with that new 6-cylinder engine, which ended up replacing all 6-cylinder Studebaker engines until World War II, and power some of their post-war cars until a V8 became available, and was the larger of the two 6s in their trucks all the way through 1960. Whew. But back to Albert Erskine. Erskine failed to cut production, to cut costs, and really respond to the Great Depression at all, and I believe that was in an effort to project strength of the corporation. Inconceivably, he gave a dividend to shareholders which was 5 times the profits for the entire year. The next year, in 1931, he also gave another smaller but large dividend, once again out of capital, not profits. And this put the company in an untenable financial situation. To try to fix this, he wanted to acquire 95% of White Motor Company. They made buses and trucks and things like that, but he was doing so at an inflated price and with more cash. To put this in perspective, in 1926, Studebaker had $26 million in working capital, and by 1932, they had $3.5 million. Unfortunately, they owed $6 million to banks, and the banks came calling and demanded repayment, and Studebaker defaulted and went into receivership. Now, Erskine had health problems. He was removed from his position at Studebaker. He was personally in debt $350,000. Remember, this was 1932. And now his Studebaker stock was essentially worthless. In June 1933, he committed suicide. By December 33, the company was back in profit, the purchase of White was canceled, and by 35 they were fully refinanced and reorganized. They began designing a new car called the Champion, whose final styling was partially the work of Virgil Exner, who went on to fame with Chrysler's, quote, forward look products. When the Champion was introduced in 1939, it doubled the company's sales. During World War II, Studebaker was busy, and historically it ranks 28th in value of wartime production contracts for the U.S., building trucks, the M29 Weasel, and engine assemblies for B-17s and others. With Exner's designs before World War II and after the war, Studebaker was well positioned to return to auto production. Their slogan was "First by far with a post-war car." While innovative, some design decisions such as the wrap-around rear window and the flat back trunk also made them a bit of a joke, a quote, "Are they coming or going?" By 1949, that strong executive team that was in place after Erskine's departure and through the end of the war were replaced with a more cautious group at the time of post-war fiscal doldrums and the sales price war between Ford and GM. Smaller manufacturers being squeezed out, and a merger became the only option to survive. As I mentioned in my AMC video, George Mason attempted to combine Studebaker-Packard, Hudson, and Nash together, but that failed. Studebaker was hampered with the highest labor cost in the industry, quality control issues, and the South Bend location made consolidation difficult with another manufacturer. Studebaker's financial mind stressed short-term earnings over a long-term vision, but by 1954, the company was losing money and they rushed into Packard's arms while hiding just how bad the situation actually was. Now, Packard, on the other hand, is a more recent company. They were founded in 1899 by James Packard, brother William, and partner George Weiss. Now, Weiss had a Winton car, and James believed as a mechanical engineer there could be improvements. One version of this story is that James bought a Winton car and it broke down on the drive home. They made suggestions to the owner, Alexander Winton, of how to improve the car, and he didn't just ignore them. He essentially told them if they could do better, go build their own car. And a little bit of historical irony, this is almost exactly the same thing that happened between Lamborghini and Ferrari. As a side note, Winton went out of business in 1924. So in November 1899, the Packard's first car was built. One buyer turned out to be a gentleman by the name of Henry Bourne Joy, a wealthy Detroiter who was so impressed he brought together a group of investors, and in 1902 the New York and Ohio Automobile Company became the Packard Motor Car Company, and soon after they moved to Detroit, building the first phase of their auto plant in 1903. Also in 1903, one of their early cars, a Model F, was the first to make a transcontinental journey from San Francisco to New York in only 63 days. When a single-cylinder engine was standard, Packard also started getting two-cylinder engines that same year. In 1904, a Model K with a new 276 cubic inch four-cylinder set 1, 5, and 10-mile land speed records. And in 1912, a Packard truck hauled a 3-ton load from New York to San Francisco to showcase their durability. There's a lot of records that Packard went on to set. We're not going to cover them all here in this video. Now, Packard focused on expensive cars starting at $2,500, when a time when an Oldsmobile runabout was about $650, and you could buy a black motor for as low as $375. And they quickly competed with Mercedes and Rolls-Royce for buyers in the US and abroad, and ultimately in 61 countries. In 1913, they introduced the Packard 6 with 3 different wheelbases, and in 1916 replaced it with the Packard Twin 6 with a 12-cylinder engine and 2 different wheelbases. Perhaps most importantly was in 1916, Alvin McCauley became president of Packard and would guide the company until 1939. He was responsible for the famous Packard slogan, quote, "Ask the man who owns one." During World War I, they built trucks as well as aircraft and marine engines. After the war, Packard transitioned back into cars. In 1921, they came out with the second generation Packard 6, officially known as the Single 6, and joined by the Single 8 in 1924. The Packard Twin 6 ended production in 1923, and in 1925 with the first appearance of the Goddess of Speed hood ornament. Each of the cars went through a variety of series updates through the 20s, with the 6 ending on 1928 with its 5th series. This is a way to address the yearly changes that the other big 3 were doing without actually redesigning the entire car. The Packard 8 was an all-new platform that lasted through 1936 and introduced with 2 wheelbases and 4 models, but multiple wheelbases were offered through its lifetime, ranging from 127.5 inches up to about 146 inches. The engines ranged from 5.2 liters up to 6.3 liters. It offered an optional 4-speed synchromesh transmission, and along with other Packards of its time, had dash-adjustable hydraulic shocks. It was a strong seller, and one reason Packard was a success in the 1920s. Through the 20s, Packards exported more cars than any other manufacturer in its price class, and in 1930 sold nearly 2 times as many as any other marque. And between 1924 and 1930, they were the top-selling luxury brand. Interesting historical note, in 1931, the Imperial House of Japan ordered 10 Packards. Of course, that Great Depression kicked off in 1929. Now, Packard's response to the Great Depression was to offer more and more expensive cars. The Twin 6 returned, eventually renamed as the Packard 12, with 2 wheelbases of 142 and 147 inches, and the same V12 with 7.3 liters, making up to 160 horsepower. Through 1939, it received multiple changes, different wheelbases, a version based on the 8, and notably the Aerosport Coupe. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave Stalin an armored Packard 12, which was apparently his favorite auto for many years. By 1932, the Standard 8 had 13 different body styles, and for 1 year only, they tried an upper medium priced car called the Light 8 in 1932. Around this time, Packard stopped being hand-built custom products as demand had dropped sharply, and while the company was in a good cash position, it was unable to compete with the massive resources that Ford and GM could put into their brands. Through 1938, they watched their competitors like Peerless, Stutz Duesenberg, and Pierce Arrow all disappearing. Faced with this reality, Packard decided to move into the medium price range. And in 1935, they introduced their first car for under $1,000. It was called the 120. It was a success, tripling sales that year and doubling again the next year. The 120 had an all-new inline 8 making 110 horsepower, offered 2-door, 4-door convertible and club coupe bodies. It introduced the independent front suspension to Packard called the Safety Flex suspension. It received yearly updates and in 1937 moved upmarket as the Packard 6 was reintroduced. After 1937, the name was dropped and became part of the 8 model range. In 1937, the 6 was technically the 15th Series 6 model 115C. Remember when I said they had multiple series of models? Well, it was now competing against Oldsmobile and DeSoto 6s and had a starting price of $895 for a 4-door sedan. Beginning in 1940, it was developed into and renamed the 110. In 1941, Packard introduced the Clipper, built on an all-new chassis using the 4.6-liter 8 from the 120. It took the brand in a new styling direction that was to spread to other models, but was introduced just 8 months before Pearl Harbor. Of an interesting note, the labor force was divided almost equally between the 12, the Super 8, and the 8 lines, and those medium-priced, more affordable lines. And although those junior models sold more than 10 times better, the senior models had far more hand labor and traditional craftsmanship. But the fact the labor force worked separately and the craftsmanship still existed on the other models, the 120 line was a double-edged sword. It certainly allowed Packard to survive, but it also diminished the prestige of the entire brand. With auto production shut down in 1942, Packard built airplane engines, specifically Merlin designs for the P-51, marine engines for PT boats, and after the war, they ended up ranking 18th for the value of wartime production contracts. After the war, Packard was in an excellent financial position and resumed car production with pre-war designs that were modestly updated. But critically, only the Clipper models and not those senior series cars were restarted. They didn't restart for a year later. The legend is that those dies were exposed to the elements and were unusable after the war. I'm not sure if that's true, but Packard's focus on the cheaper cars essentially allowed Cadillac to leapfrog them and dominate afterwards. That sharp-looking Clipper had many design changes, but being a fresh design in 1942 meant that its third or fourth year of production is now actually the fifth or sixth year after the design was introduced, and it quickly began to look dated. There were many options available to the company, but in 1948, they released a redesign that was poorly received and described as an upside-down bathtub or a pregnant elephant. At almost exactly the same time, GM unveiled lower and sleeker models. To add to the problems, Packard was still using the same old engines when Cadillac debuted a brand new overhead valve V8. Now, Packard outsold Cadillac until 1950, but increasingly their sales were reliant on more models and further down the price ladder, meaning they were now perceived more of a competitor to Buick than Cadillac. One stark example of their increasingly untenable financial position was that while Cadillac had an automatic transmission, the Hydra-Matic introduced in 1941, and a new overhead valve V8 in 1949, Packard could only afford to design one or the other. This left them with an old and out of date and out of favor 8 and their new Ultramatic that was more expensive, less reliable, and didn't shift as well as Cadillac's offering. In 1951, Packards were redesigned. It was much more contemporary, but also ended up having some styling similarities to Oldsmobile, and while they sold well, it was not exceptional. By this time, Packard was considered dowdy and old-fashioned, capturing few new buyers. The average age of the board was 67, and when Macaulay retired in 48, he was about 76 years old. It's fascinating that Packard at the time had no pension plan for executives, so few of them were ready to leave the company and create positions for new executives to move up. In contemporary parlance, the company was in desperate need of some new blood. In 1952, James Nance was appointed president, and he was 52 years old, a decade younger than the next youngest Packard executive. I have more information on him in the AMC video, but he saw that the big three had won, and that the only way for smaller manufacturers to survive would be to band together. He immediately created a pension plan, stopped production of mid-priced cars, and strove to move upmarket again to compete with Cadillac. They had some low volume, like 750 units, of the Caribbean convertible, which was very well received. The lineup had been confusingly overhauled, but by 1953 showed a sales decrease. As often mentioned, Ford and GM engaged in a brutal price war at this time, hammering profits for smaller manufacturers. Of particular note is that Chrysler and Ford actually sought out Packard dealers to, quote, steal them away, which made selling their cars even more difficult. Now, both Nance of Packard and George Mason over of Nash knew that merging was necessary, and Mason had a plan to combine Hudson, Nash, Packard, and Studebaker. Ultimately, the deal was torpedoed when Nance insisted he be the one to run the merged company. So when Nash and Hudson merged to become AMC, Packard and Studebaker ended up falling into each other's arms on October 1st, 1954. While smaller, Packard took over Studebaker, but in their rush to merge together and honestly to try to survive, they didn't do their adequate due diligence. And what they found was a company in such bad financial straits, it actually threatened both companies. With their high labor costs for workers and retirees, convoluted manufacturing, Studebaker's break-even point was 282,000 cars at a time when they'd only just sold 82,000 in 1954. One hope was to add Studebaker's dealer network to boost Packard sales and helping offset the dealers that would be stolen away, but by 1956, 2 years later, about 30% of Studebaker's dealers had left. The 1954 models were lightly updated, but in 1955 the new Packards were released with new styling and new suspension that kept the car level regardless of road conditions, and their new 5.8-liter overhead valve V8. But the problems continued to brew. The company that supplied the bodies was sold to Chrysler, who promptly told Packard to, quote, hit the road. The new bodies were produced at an undersized plant that couldn't keep up while also having quality problems. The automatic transmission was problematic. They had issues with electrical accessories. This further hurt the company's image, and sales plummeted by 1956. Notably, about this time, one guy by the name of John Z. DeLorean left and went to work at GM. In 1956, the Clipper became a separate make, and the Packard Clipper now mirrored the Lincoln Mercury business model. Each Packard body style got its own name. The Patrician was a four-door sedan, the 400 a hardtop coupe, Caribbean the convertible, and vinyl-roofed two-door. Counterintuitively, they introduced the Executive, a lower-priced Packard built on the Clipper platform and intended to be for those who wanted luxury but couldn't afford or justify the Packard cost. Exactly opposite of what Nance's vision for Packard had actually been. Amid dismal results, in 1956, Nance was dismissed from the company and ended up moving over to Ford. Packard was increasingly using Studebaker platforms and designs, and in 1957, no more Packard designs were being used, and the Clipper disappeared as a separate brand. With Nance gone, Studebaker-Packard entered a management agreement with Curtiss Wright Corporation, and their president, Roy T. Hurley, ordered the closing of Packard production in Detroit, and all auto efforts were shifted to South Bend. The Packards for 1957 and 58 were almost badge-engineered versions of Studebaker Presidents and are referred to as Packard Bakers. Studebaker also negotiated the distribution rights for Mercedes-Benz, giving their dealer network another product, which they eventually sold back to Mercedes in 1975. New leadership meant new direction, to largely abandon the full-size market and to not fight the big three head-on in size, features, or styling. The company continued to try to compete in autos primarily by cobbling together new cars from old parts. Based on the Studebaker Champion, they created the Scotsman in 1957, essentially a no-frills model focused on frugal and low-budget buyers and offering exceptional value. It was a modest hit, but only sold through 1958, although there was a pickup version from 58 to 59. Now, buoyed by the Scotsman's success, in 59, the Lark was their entry into the compact field and sold very well until the big names entered the category in 61. Based on the full-size Studebakers that were introduced in 53, but shortened the wheelbase ahead of the firewall to reduce the overhangs, leaving a car that was smaller but with still very generous interior space. They sold well, but it's interesting to note they essentially entered the same market as the Rambler line for AMC. As the big three entered, sales plummeted, and they redesigned it again in 62 with an elegant redo that boosted sales considerably. It was again redesigned in 64 to a much more mainstream look. Also based on the 53 hardtops was the Hawk, produced between 57 and 59 with various names and replaced in 62 with the GT Hawk until 64. Finally, it must be mentioned the Avanti was introduced in 62. Legend says that the president literally sketched out a Studebaker competitor to the Thunderbird on an envelope or a napkin while on a plane ride. A two-door, four-seat, fiberglass body personal car based on the Lark chassis and the 289 engine from the Hawk, with a supercharger option. The goal for 1962 was 20,000 sales, but many problems with the fit and the finish and the supplier of the bodies all led to delays and canceled orders. Only 1,200 were sold in 62 and another approximately 4,600 in 63. In 1960, the company had rapidly begun diversifying, buying companies that were in generators, plastic, floor cleaners, lawnmowers, tractors, tire studs, and more. By 1961, the company dropped Packard from the name again and became Studebaker. In December 63, they announced they were closing the South Bend plant. The Avanti name, tooling, and the plant space were sold to a partnership who revived the car in 1965. Limited production continued at their last production facility in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and continued until 1966. This one plant was very nearly successful in selling 20,000 cars and being profitable, but Studebaker exited the auto business on March 17, 1965. Those last 65 and 66 cars used engines sourced from GM Canada and based on the Chevy 230 cubic inch and 283 cubic inch 6s and V8s. Several historic notes to the Studebaker story. The company and its diversified portfolio merged with Wagner Electric, then merged again, and in '79, McGraw-Edison bought them. The name disappeared from business history in its hyphenated form. The Avanti name ended up living on through multiple owners and over the decades being produced in ever more modified versions. It's become famous in its own right, and much like Madonna, is often known as the Avanti, and people don't often remember it was ever a Studebaker. Finally, I mentioned in 1926 that Studebaker created the first ever auto testing facility, beating Packard by about a year. In 1937, they planted 5,000 trees that spelled out the name Studebaker from the air. Eventually, this became a public park, and although it was damaged by some natural events over time, the name can still be seen from the air, and actually you can see it on Google Earth. Studebaker and Packard are another sad tale of early manufacturers who did amazing things, and through bad leadership, bad luck, or crippling competition, they just ended up fading away. There are so many what could have been moments all along the way that are all seen with the clarity of hindsight. I was stunned at the rich history of Studebaker from the 1700s and the decisions that left them hemorrhaging money in the Great Depression. And Packard is one of those preeminent luxury brands in the world, took a poison pill to move down market that left them surviving but diminished their brand, putting their business in the position where they were no longer one of those premier luxury brands of the world, but now they're not really competing with much larger size brands like Chevy or Ford. Nance's idea of making Packard luxury and Studebaker volume sounds great on paper, but expanding to Clipper while unable to shore up the finances ended up just dooming the brand. By the late 1950s, it seems they were struggling to launch a car that would give a one-year sales boost, and then just like a junkie, they'd have to go out and find that next minor hit to get them through to the next year and stave off bankruptcy. At the end, it's a miracle the cars they were building with such limited resources, yet surprising they ended up surviving into the 60s at all. One has to dream that if that four-way merger had ever occurred, a Ford-brand AMC may have been competitive and be able to at least control their own destiny. Earlier I talked about the Three Musketeers headed by Fred Zetter, and who were wooed away from Studebaker and ultimately to Chrysler. Well, the original Chrysler logo has what looks like lightning bolts on it, but those are in fact stylized Z's in tribute to Zetter. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these type of videos, please like it, please subscribe, and if you want to support independent news, opinions, and histories, please consider being a Patreon. Thanks for being here. Bye. As the big three entered, sales plummeted and they redesigned